The autumn wind howled through the Colorado Rockies like a banshee's cry, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the weight of desperation. 9 small figures huddled against the massive oak door of a remote mountain ranch house, there, bare feet bleeding on the frost-covered porch, their thin bodies shaking with cold and hunger. The oldest, barely 12, raised her trembling fist and knocked with what little strength remained in her frail arm. Jacob Sullivan had heard them coming long before they reached his door. His weathered hands paused over the evening's solitary meal as the sound of children's voices drifted through the mountain air. In 37 years of living alone on this isolated ranch, he had never heard such sounds. Children did not come to Whispering Pine Ranch. Nobody came to Whispering Pine Ranch. When the knock finally came, soft and desperate, Jacob stood motionless for a long moment. He was a man who had chosen silence over society, solitude over connection, peace over the chaos that other human beings inevitably brought. The children on his porch represented everything he had spent decades avoiding. But something in that tentative knock spoke of a desperation that transcended his carefully constructed boundaries. Against every instinct that had kept him safe and alone for so many years, Jacob Sullivan walked to his door and opened it to find 9 pairs of dark eyes staring up at him with a mixture of hope and terror that would change his life forever. "We're dying, sir," whispered the oldest girl, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Jacob Sullivan had not spoken to another human being in 3 months, and he preferred it that way. His ranch house sat perched on the edge of a granite cliff, 2 miles up a treacherous mountain road that discouraged all but the most determined visitors. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was a 4-hour ride through terrain that claimed lives every winter. It was exactly the kind of isolation Jacob had sought when he'd purchased this land with the last of his inheritance 15 years ago. The morning of October 12th, 1887, began like every other morning for the past decade and a half. Jacob rose before dawn, tended to his small herd of cattle, repaired whatever fence the mountain weather had damaged overnight, and spoke only to his horse, a sturdy quarter horse named Ranger who seemed to appreciate silence as much as his owner did. The routine was predictable, comfortable, and most importantly, it involved no other people. At 42, Jacob was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains he called home. 6 feet tall with broad shoulders earned through years of manual labor, he moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to rely entirely on himself. His brown hair was prematurely gray at the temples, and his green eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much of the world and chosen to retreat from it. The scars on his hands told stories he never shared. The deeper scars, the ones that couldn't be seen, were the reason he had retreated to this mountain in the first place. Jacob Sullivan was a man running from ghosts, and solitude was his only defense against the memories that haunted him. His ranch was modest but well maintained. The main house, built from logs he had cut and shaped himself, contained 4 rooms, a kitchen that doubled as a living area, a small bedroom, a storage room, and a workshop where he crafted the furniture and tools he needed. Behind the house stood a sturdy barn that sheltered his livestock and stored hay for the winter months. A root cellar carved into the hillside kept his food supplies cool and protected. Everything about Jacob's life was designed for independence. He raised enough cattle to trade for supplies twice a year when he made his reluctant trips to Cedar Falls. He hunted deer and elk for meat, grew vegetables in a carefully tended garden, and had learned to make or repair anything he might need. The nearest neighbor lived 23 miles away, and Jacob had managed to avoid meeting him for over a decade. Books were his only companions, shelves lined with volumes on everything from animal husbandry to classical literature. In the evenings, After his work was done, Jacob would sit by his fireplace and read by lamplight, sometimes until well past midnight. The silence of the mountains was his symphony, the changing seasons his calendar, the daily routine of survival, his purpose. But Jacob's carefully constructed world rested on foundations that were less stable than they appeared. The isolation that protected him from painful memories also left him vulnerable in ways he refused to acknowledge. His provisions for winter were always calculated for one person. His medical supplies were basic at best. His emotional reserves, depleted by years of avoiding human connection, were stretched thin by the constant effort required to maintain his solitary existence. The irony was that Jacob Sullivan, who had spent 15 years avoiding people, was exceptionally good with them when circumstances forced interaction. During his rare trips to Cedar Falls, shopkeepers and townspeople often commented on his quiet competence, his fair dealings, and his unexpected gentleness with children and animals. These glimpses of his true nature always left Jacob uncomfortable, reminders of the person he had been before life had taught him that caring about others led only to loss and pain. His past was a carefully guarded secret, known only to the banker who had handled his land purchase and the lawyer who had helped him establish legal ownership. Jacob had been born in Pennsylvania, the youngest son of a prosperous farming family. He had served as a cavalry officer during the Indian Wars, rising to the rank of captain before a series of events in Arizona Territory had shattered his faith in military justice and his own moral compass. The nightmares still came sometimes. Visions of villages burning and children screaming, of orders that should never have been given and actions that could never be undone. Jacob had resigned his commission in disgrace, spent 2 years drinking his way across the frontier, and finally found sobriety and a measure of peace only when he retreated to these mountains where his past could not follow. His military experience, ironically, had made him exceptionally well suited for frontier life. He could read weather patterns, track animals, navigate by stars, and survive in conditions that would kill most men. His medical training, learned through necessity during his cavalry days, was more extensive than that of many frontier doctors. His understanding of tactics and supply management made him a formidable planner and strategist. But perhaps most importantly, Jacob's military background had taught him to recognize desperation when he saw it. He understood the difference between genuine need and manipulation, between crisis and mere inconvenience. These skills, dormant for years in his isolated existence, would prove crucial in the hours to come. The ranch itself sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by peaks that rose another 1,000 feet above the house. Pine and aspen forests covered the slopes, providing timber, game, and protection from the worst mountain storms. A year-round spring provided fresh water, and the meadows below the house grew enough grass to support his cattle through the summer months. It was beautiful country, harsh but magnificent, the kind of landscape that either broke people or transformed them into something harder and more resilient than they had been before. Jacob had chosen to let it break him, to use its isolation as a shield against further involvement in the messy, painful business of human relationships. The morning routine that had governed his life for 15 years began, as always, with checking the animals. His 12 head of cattle were hardy mountain stock, bred for survival in high-altitude conditions. The barn housed Ranger, 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and a pair of goats that provided milk and cheese. Everything was healthy, well-fed, and prepared for the coming winter. Jacob's thoughts had turned increasingly to winter preparations. The first serious snow could come any time after Halloween, and once it began, he might not see another human being until spring. His root cellar was stocked with potatoes, carrots, and preserved vegetables. Smoked meat hung in his smokehouse. Firewood was stacked in neat cords against the north wall of the house, enough to last through the harshest mountain winter. On this particular morning, as Jacob checked the fence line that bordered his eastern pasture, something felt different about the mountain. The air carried an unusual stillness, and the wildlife seemed more agitated than normal. His cattle clustered together near the barn instead of spreading out to graze, and even Ranger seemed nervous, ears constantly swiveling towards sounds Jacob couldn't identify. Jacob had learned to trust these subtle warnings over his years in the mountains. Animals sensed changes in weather, predators, and human presence long before people did. Something was moving through his territory, something that didn't belong. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle he always carried during his rounds, though he couldn't say exactly what had triggered the precaution. As the day progressed, the feeling of wrongness only intensified. By evening, as Jacob sat down to his usual solitary dinner of venison stew and cornbread, he found himself listening to every sound outside his windows. The October wind was picking up, bringing with it the promise of the season's first real storm, but beneath its familiar howl, Jacob's trained ear detected something else. Voices, human voices, faint but unmistakable, carried on the mountain air. Children's voices. Jacob set down his spoon and moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. In 15 years of mountain living, children had never ventured anywhere near his property. Cedar Falls was too far away, and there were no other settlements within 50 miles that housed families with young ones. Yet there was no mistaking what he heard. The voices were getting closer, and as they did, Jacob began to make out individual words. They were speaking in a mixture of English and what sounded like Apache, their tones carrying a desperation that made his chest tighten with unwanted recognition. These were not the voices of children at play. These were the voices of children in trouble, despite every instinct that told him to bar his door and pretend he had heard nothing. Jacob found himself moving toward the front of the house. His military training had taught him to recognize a tactical situation, and every sense was telling him that whatever was approaching his ranch represented a crisis of significant proportions. The wind gusted harder, rattling the windows and sending pine needles scratching across his roof like skeletal fingers. Through the sound, Jacob could now make out footsteps on his porch, slow and unsteady, the shuffle of exhausted feet. Then came the knock, so soft he almost missed it, the tentative rap of someone who had little hope of receiving help, but no other options remaining. Jacob Sullivan, who had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of human connection, found himself walking toward his door with the certainty that his carefully constructed world was about to change forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jacob's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle, a reaction that surprised him. 15 years of mountain solitude had taught him to control every aspect of his environment, but the soft desperation in that knock had bypassed all his carefully constructed defenses. He paused, listening to the wind howl around his cabin, carrying with it the faint sound of labored breathing from the other side of his door. When he finally opened it, the sight that greeted him defied everything he thought he knew about his isolated corner of the world. 9 children huddled together on his porch like a cluster of autumn leaves blown against his door by the mountain wind. They ranged in age from what appeared to be about 6 to perhaps 12 years old, their dark hair whipping around faces, gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Their clothes were little more than rags, thin cotton garments that offered no protection against the October cold that was already turning their breath into white puffs. Several were barefoot, their feet cracked, and bleeding from what must have been days of walking across rocky mountain terrain. Others wore makeshift moccasins that had been reduced to strips of leather barely clinging to their soles. But it was their eyes that hit Jacob like a physical blow. In his military days, he had seen those same eyes in the faces of soldiers who had been pushed beyond their breaking point, children who had witnessed horrors no child should ever see. These were the eyes of survivors, old beyond their years, carrying burdens that had aged them in ways that time alone never could. The oldest, a girl with braided black hair and intelligent dark eyes, stepped forward slightly. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she held herself with a dignity that reminded Jacob of the Apache leaders he had encountered during his cavalry days. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her English was clear and carefully pronounced. "Please, sir," she said, her small hands clasped together in front of her chest. "We have been walking for many days. My brothers and sisters are very hungry, very cold. We saw your light from the valley below." She paused, gathering strength for what she knew would be the most important words she would ever speak. "We're dying, sir. Please help us." Behind her, the other children pressed closer together, their eyes fixed on Jacob's face, with a mixture of hope and terror. The smaller ones were clearly beyond exhaustion, swaying on their feet, kept upright only by the support of their companions. One little boy, who couldn't have been more than 7, was coughing with the deep, wet sound that Jacob recognized as the beginning of pneumonia. Jacob's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. Children this young couldn't have traveled far on their own, which meant something catastrophic must have happened to bring them to his door. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing the tactical situation even as his conscience grappled with the moral implications of what he was seeing. "Where did you come from?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended after months of disuse. "Where are your parents?" The girl's composure cracked slightly at the question, tears welling in her eyes before she forced them back with visible effort. "Our village," she whispered. 3 days' walk toward the rising sun. The soldiers came. They said we had to go to the reservation, but the winter sickness was already there, killing the children. Our parents told us to run." The words hit Jacob like bullets, each one carrying the weight of a tragedy he understood all too well. He had been one of those soldiers once, had carried out similar orders, had witnessed the devastation that followed when military policy collided with human reality. The irony was not lost on him that the same uniform he had once worn in service to those policies had driven him to this mountain refuge. And now the consequences of those same policies had followed him here. "The others?" he asked quietly, though he dreaded the answer. "Some went with the soldiers," the girl replied, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her cheeks. "Some fought, some—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jacob understood. He had seen enough military actions to know how these situations typically ended. One of the smaller children, a boy of perhaps 8, suddenly swayed and would have fallen if the girl hadn't caught him. His skin was flushed with fever, and his breathing was labored. Jacob's medical training kicked in automatically as he assessed the child's condition. Without proper care and warmth, the boy would be dead within hours. "How long since you've eaten?" Jacob asked, already knowing the answer would be worse than he hoped. "Yesterday morning we found some berries," the girl replied. "Before that, 2 days. We tried to hunt, but we have no weapons, no traps. We are not—" She searched for the right word. "We are not wilderness children. Our village grew corn and squash. We traded with the white settlements for other food." Jacob's strategic mind was already calculating resources and implications. 9 children meant 9 mouths to feed through what promised to be a harsh winter. His carefully planned food supplies, calculated for 1 person, would be inadequate. More critically, the approaching storm system would make travel impossible for days, possibly weeks. These children weren't just asking for temporary shelter. They were asking him to take responsibility for their survival through the most dangerous season of the mountain year. The fever-ridden boy coughed again, a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. Jacob recognized the signs of exposure and malnutrition-induced illness. Without immediate intervention, at least 3 of the children would not survive the night, regardless of what he decided about long-term care. "What are your names?" he asked, surprised to hear himself asking the question. Knowing their names would make them real, would transform them from a tactical problem into individual human beings with histories and futures and claims on his conscience. The oldest girl straightened slightly, recognizing something in his tone that gave her hope. "I am Running Deer," she said with formal dignity. "This is my brother Firewalker," she indicated the fevered boy she was supporting. "These are our cousins and friends from our village. Silent Fox, Little Wolf, Morning Star, Singing Bird, Stone Bear, Quiet Thunder, and Small Eagle." Each name carried the weight of a truncated childhood of children forced to become adults too quickly by circumstances beyond their control. Jacob found himself looking at each face as it was named, seeing past the dirt and exhaustion to the individual personalities underneath. Despite their desperate situation, he could see traces of humor in some faces, determination in others, and in all of them, a resilience that spoke to the strength of their people. The wind gusted harder, driving the temperature down another few degrees and making the children huddle closer together for warmth. Jacob realized he was facing a decision that would define not just the next few hours, but potentially the rest of his life. He could provide temporary shelter, feed them, and send them on their way when the weather cleared. Or he could turn them away and maintain the isolation that had protected him for 15 years. But looking at Firewalker's flushed face and labored breathing, Jacob knew there was really no choice at all. Military training and basic human decency both led to the same conclusion. These children would die without immediate help, and he was the only person in 50 miles capable of providing it. "Can you walk a little further?" he asked Running Deer. "To the barn. It will be warmer there, and I can tend to your brother properly." Relief flooded the girl's face as she realized what his question meant. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "We can walk." Jacob grabbed his heaviest coat from the peg by the door and wrapped it around Firewalker's small frame. The boy was barely conscious, his body temperature dangerously elevated despite the cold mountain air. As Jacob lifted him, he was shocked by how light the child was, how little flesh covered the sharp edges of his bones. "Follow me," he said to the others, leading them around the side of the house toward the barn. "Stay close together. Watch your footing." The barn was indeed warmer, heated by the body warmth of his animals and insulated against the worst of the mountain wind. Jacob quickly cleared space in the hay storage area, creating a makeshift shelter that would provide immediate protection from the elements. His mind was already working through the logistics of caring for 9 children, through a mountain winter, calculating food requirements, sleeping arrangements, and medical needs. As he settled Firewalker into a nest of clean hay and began assessing his condition, Jacob realized that his 15 years of carefully maintained isolation had just come to an abrupt end. The ghosts he had been running from would have to wait. The living needed his attention more than the dead needed his guilt. Running Deer knelt beside her brother, her small hand stroking his fevered forehead with practiced care. "Will he live?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had already seen too much death. Jacob looked at the little boy's flushed face, listened to his labored breathing, and thought about the medical supplies in his house, the food in his stores, and the long winter stretching ahead of them all. "Yes," he said finally, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "He'll live. They'll all live." It was a promise that would cost him everything he had built and change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But as he looked around at the 9 pairs of eyes watching him with desperate hope, Jacob Sullivan discovered that some promises were worth making, regardless of their cost. The crisis that had driven these children to his door was about to transform not just their lives, but his own, in ways that would echo through the mountains for generations to come. The first night nearly broke Jacob's resolve before it had truly begun. Firewalker's fever spiked just after midnight, his small body convulsing with chills despite the wool blankets Jacob had piled around him. The other children huddled in the hay, watching with wide, terrified eyes as their friend fought for his life in the dim light of Jacob's kerosene lantern. Outside, the October storm that had been threatening all day finally unleashed its fury, battering the barn with wind and driving sleet that found every crack in the weathered wood. Jacob knelt beside the fevered boy, his hands working automatically to cool the burning skin with damp cloths, while his mind calculated odds and resources with the cold precision of his military training. Firewalker was severely dehydrated and malnourished, his body's defenses weakened by days of exposure and starvation. Without proper medicine, the pneumonia that was settling into his lungs could kill him within hours. "Is there anything we can do?" Running Deer whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. She had not left her brother's side since they arrived, her small hand constantly stroking his dark hair with a tenderness that reminded Jacob painfully of memories he had spent years trying to suppress. Jacob looked at his limited medical supplies spread out on the barn floor. Willow bark for fever, pine needle tea for respiratory ailments, honey for infection, and various herbs he had gathered over the years for common ailments. It was frontier medicine at best, crude and unreliable compared to what the boy truly needed. In a proper hospital, Firewalker might have had a fighting chance. Here, in a barn 50 miles from the nearest doctor, Jacob was working with tools that hadn't advanced much beyond what pioneer women had used for generations. "We'll do everything we can," he said finally, mixing another batch of willow bark tea. "But he needs to fight too. He needs to want to live." Running Deer nodded solemnly, understanding passing between them that needed no words. She had already seen too much death, knew too well how quickly life could slip away from someone so young. Her composure was remarkable, but Jacob could see the cracks in her careful control, the way her hands trembled slightly as she helped him tend to her brother. The other children had arranged themselves in a protective circle around Firewalker, sharing their body heat and what little comfort they could provide. Silent Fox, a boy of about 10 with observant eyes, had taken charge of keeping the younger ones calm. Little Wolf, despite being only 9, helped Jacob by fetching water and organizing supplies with a maturity that spoke to the harsh realities these children had already faced. As the hours passed and Firewalker's condition remained critical, Jacob found himself confronting the full magnitude of what he had taken on. 9 children meant 9 different personalities, needs, fears, and medical concerns. Morning Star, a girl of about 8, had infected cuts on her feet that needed constant cleaning and bandaging. Stone Bear, the youngest at 6, showed signs of severe malnutrition that would require careful nutritional rehabilitation. Quiet Thunder had what appeared to be a partially healed broken wrist that had set incorrectly and would need attention once the immediate crises were addressed. But beyond the immediate medical needs lay deeper challenges that Jacob was only beginning to understand. These children had survived a trauma that would have broken many adults. They had watched their community destroyed, their families scattered or killed, their entire world torn apart by forces beyond their control. The psychological wounds they carried were invisible but potentially more dangerous than their physical ailments. As dawn approached and Firewalker's fever finally began to break, Jacob allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The boy's breathing was easier, his skin cooler to the touch, and he had managed to keep down some broth. But even as relief washed over him, Jacob was calculating the resources this small victory had cost. He had used nearly half of his willow bark supply in one night. His honey stores, carefully rationed to last through winter, were already depleted by a third. Most critically, he had burned through firewood at an unsustainable rate, trying to keep the barn warm enough for the sick children. At this pace, his carefully calculated winter supplies would be exhausted long before spring arrived. The storm outside showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified during the night, transforming from autumn rain and wind into something approaching an early blizzard. Snow was beginning to accumulate against the barn walls, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Travel would be impossible for days, possibly weeks, if this weather system stalled over the mountains, as they sometimes did. Jacob stepped outside briefly to check on his cattle and assess the storm's severity. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the wind drove ice crystals into his face with stinging force. His animals were huddled together in the lee of the barn, their winter coats already beginning to develop, but not yet adequate for this kind of weather. He would need to bring them into the barn soon, which would mean even less space for the children. When he returned to the barn, he found Running Deer awake and alert, watching over her sleeping companions with the vigilance of someone who understood that safety was always temporary. She looked up as he entered, snow still clinging to his coat and beard. "The storm is very bad," she observed quietly. "We cannot leave soon." Jacob nodded, appreciating her directness. "It may be several days, possibly longer. This kind of weather can settle in for weeks in these mountains." Running Deer absorbed this information without visible emotion, but Jacob could see her mind working, calculating implications just as he had been doing. "We do not have enough food," she said simply. "You prepared for one person, not 10. The acknowledgement of their desperate situation hung between them like a challenge. Jacob had been avoiding this calculation, focusing on immediate medical needs rather than the longer-term implications of feeding 9 additional people through a mountain winter. But Running Deer's blunt assessment forced him to confront the mathematics of survival. "We'll make it work," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I can hunt, trap, stretch what we have." In this weather. Running Deer's question was not accusatory, merely practical. "And what of the little ones when you are gone hunting? What if you do not return?" The questions revealed the depth of responsibility. Jacob had assumed these children were now completely dependent on him for survival. Any mistake in judgment, any accident while hunting or gathering supplies would likely result in all their deaths. The weight of it was staggering. Firewalker stirred in his sleep, murmuring words in Apache that Jacob didn't understand. "Running." Deer responded in the same language, her voice soft and reassuring. The exchange reminded Jacob of how little he actually knew about these children, beyond their immediate physical needs. They had their own language, customs, beliefs, and ways of understanding the world that were completely foreign to him. "What did he say?" Jacob asked quietly. "He asked for our mother," Running Deer replied, her composure finally cracking slightly. "He dreams of home, of the time before." She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the show of emotion. "I told him Mother's spirit watches over him, that he is safe now." The simple exchange revealed layers of loss that Jacob was only beginning to comprehend. These children weren't just physically displaced, they were culturally adrift, torn from everything that had given meaning and structure to their young lives. They were grieving not just for family members they might never see again, but for an entire way of life that had been destroyed. As the second day dawned grey and cold, with the storm still raging outside, Jacob began to understand that his crisis was far more complex than simple survival. He wasn't just responsible for keeping these children alive through the winter. He was responsible for helping them find reasons to want to stay alive, for giving them hope that life could still hold meaning despite everything they had lost. The isolation that had once protected Jacob from the pain of human connection now trapped him with 9 children whose very existence demanded that he engage with life in ways he had spent 15 years avoiding. Every medical decision, every allocation of scarce resources, every word of comfort or encouragement required him to step further away from the emotional numbness that had been his refuge. By the 3rd morning, with Firewalker finally showing signs of recovery and the other children beginning to exhibit the first tentative signs of trust, Jacob realized that his carefully constructed world of solitude and self-protection was crumbling around him. The walls he had built to keep the world out had become a prison that now trapped him with responsibilities he was no longer sure he was strong enough to handle. But as he watched Running Deer help her younger companions wash their faces in a basin of warm water, as he saw Small Eagle attempt his first shy smile since arriving, as he heard the gentle murmur of Apache lullabies being sung to comfort the frightened ones, Jacob began to understand that his isolation hadn't protected him from pain at all. It had only protected him from the possibility of healing. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but inside the barn, something was beginning to shift. The crisis that had brought these children to his door was forcing Jacob to confront not just their desperate need, but his own. For 15 years, he had been dying a slow death of the soul, convincing himself that solitude was safety. Now, surrounded by 9 children who had lost everything but were still fighting to live, Jacob Sullivan was beginning to remember what it felt like to be truly alive. On the 6th morning after the storm had trapped them together, Jacob woke to find Running Deer standing at the barn door, staring intently toward the mountain trail that led down to the valley. Her posture was rigid with attention, her head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds beyond Jacob's perception. The storm had finally broken during the night, leaving behind a crystalline world of fresh snow and diamond-bright air. "What is it?" Jacob asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. His own senses, sharpened by years of mountain living, had detected nothing unusual in the morning stillness. "Riders," Running Deer said simply. "2 horses moving carefully up the trail. They will be here before the sun reaches the tall pine." Jacob strained his ears but heard only the whisper of wind through snow-laden branches and the distant call of a mountain hawk. Yet he had learned not to question the girl's perceptions. In their few days together, she had demonstrated an awareness of her surroundings that exceeded even his own wilderness-trained senses. If Running Deer said riders were coming, then riders were indeed approaching his isolated ranch. The implications sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. In 15 years of self-imposed exile, unexpected visitors had never brought good news. Military patrols searching for army deserters, federal marshals investigating reports of illegal activity, bounty hunters following cold trails. Each possibility carried the potential to destroy the fragile sanctuary he had built for himself and the children. "Wake the others," he instructed Running Deer, quietly. "Move them to the back of the barn, behind the hay bales. If these visitors mean trouble, I want you hidden until I can assess the situation." Running Deer nodded and moved silently among her sleeping companions, rousing them with gentle touches and whispered words in Apache. The children responded with the practiced stealth of those who had learned that survival often depended on invisibility. Within minutes, 9 small figures had melted into the shadows at the rear of the barn, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. Jacob checked his rifle, confirming the load and action with movements made automatic by decades of military training. He positioned himself near the barn's main entrance, where he could observe the approaching riders, while maintaining cover behind the thick timber walls. Whatever was coming up his mountain, he would face it as he had faced every challenge for the past 15 years, alone and on his own terms. The riders emerged from the tree line just as Running Deer had predicted, their horses picking their way carefully through the snow-covered rocks that marked the final approach to Jacob's ranch. From his concealed position, Jacob studied the newcomers with the analytical eye of a former cavalry officer, assessing their capabilities, intentions, and potential threat level. The first rider was a man of perhaps 60, tall and lean in the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. He wore the practical clothing of a working rancher, heavy wool coat, weathered leather chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. More significantly, he rode with the relaxed alertness of someone comfortable in wild country, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead while his hands remained loose on the reins. The second rider was younger, perhaps 30, with the compact build and careful movements of someone accustomed to physical work. Unlike his companion, this man carried himself with attention that spoke of recent stress or worry. His clothes were similar to the older man's but newer, less seasoned by weather and hard use. Most tellingly, he wore a gun belt with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use the weapon it carried. Jacob's military experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that distinguished friendly visitors from potential threats. These men rode openly, making no attempt at stealth or concealment. They had approached along the main trail rather than trying to circle behind his position. Most importantly, they had their hands visible and their weapons secured. Whatever in their business, they weren't planning an immediate attack. Still, Jacob remained hidden as the riders approached his cabin. The older man dismounted first, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He studied the cabin's exterior with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading signs of habitation, taking note of the smoke rising from the chimney, the cleared paths between buildings, and the general state of maintenance that spoke of careful stewardship. "Hello, the house," the older man called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Name's Marcus Henderson, from Down Valley. Here's my son-in-law, Tom Bradley. We're looking for Jacob Sullivan, hoping he might spare us a few minutes of conversation." The use of his name sent another chill through Jacob. Very few people knew his identity, and those who did had good reasons to keep that information confidential. The fact that these strangers had not only found his location, but knew who lived there, suggested either extensive investigation or information from highly placed sources. Jacob remained silent, weighing his options. He could continue hiding, hoping the men would eventually give up and leave. He could emerge armed and demand explanations before allowing them closer to his property. Or he could trust in their apparently peaceful intentions and respond as a civilized man should to visitors who had braved dangerous mountain travel to reach his door. The decision was made for him when Small Eagle, the youngest of the children, suddenly sneezed from his hiding place behind the hay bales. The sound was tiny but unmistakable in the morning stillness. Both riders turned immediately toward the barn, their postures shifting from casual alertness to focused attention. "Sounds like you might have company, Mr. Sullivan," Marcus Henderson called out, his tone remaining friendly but carrying new undertones of curiosity. "We heard there might be some folks up here needing help. That's actually why we came." Jacob's mind raced as he tried to process this unexpected development. How could these strangers possibly know about the children? Who could have told them? And most critically, did their knowledge represent an opportunity for help or a new threat to the safety he had tried to provide? Running Deer appeared silently at his elbow, having moved from her hiding place with the fluid grace of a shadow. "They do not feel dangerous," she whispered, her dark eyes studying the two men through a gap in the barn wall. "The older one has kind eyes. The younger one is worried, but not angry." Jacob looked down at the girl, once again struck by her remarkable perceptiveness. In their short time together, Running Deer had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read people's intentions and emotions. If she sensed no immediate threat from these visitors, perhaps it was worth the risk to engage with them. "Stay hidden until I signal otherwise," he instructed the girl. "But be ready to run if something goes wrong." Jacob stepped out of the barn, his rifle held in a non-threatening but ready position. The two riders turned toward him, and he found himself looking into faces that showed relief rather than hostility at his appearance. "Mr. Sullivan, Marcus," Henderson said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Much obliged for showing yourself. We've ridden a fair piece to get here, and we're hoping you might be willing to listen to what we have to say." "Depends on what you're here to say," Jacob replied, his voice rusty from disuse but steady. "And how you came to know my name and location." Henderson smiled, the expression genuine and unthreatening. "Fair questions, and we'll answer them straight. My ranch is about 30 miles southeast of here, near the town of Millerville. 3 days ago, a young Apache woman came to our settlement, half dead from exhaustion and exposure. She was looking for her children." Jacob felt his heart skip a beat. "Children?" "9 of them." Tom Bradley spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the strain of recent emotional stress. She described them to anyone who would listen, said they'd been separated when their village was hit by a military patrol. She was following their trail, trying to track them through the mountains. When the storm hit. Henderson nodded, taking up the story. "Woman nearly died from exposure, but she wouldn't stop talking about her babies. Described the oldest girl, said her name was Running Deer. Talked about a sick boy called Firewalker and 7 others. Said they'd been heading toward the high country when she lost their trail." The names hit Jacob like physical blows. These men weren't just speaking of random Apache children. They were talking specifically about the 9 refugees currently hidden in his barn. More incredibly, they were suggesting that at least one parent had survived the disaster that had scattered these families. "There's more," Bradley continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The woman, her name's Maria Lightfoot. She was my wife's sister. My wife died 2 years back, but Maria and her children used to visit us regular before all the trouble started. When she showed up looking half dead and talking about her lost babies, we knew we had to help." Jacob stared at the 2 men, trying to process the implications of what they were telling him. If this Maria Lightfoot was indeed related to the children, in his care, if she was actively searching for them despite the obvious dangers, then the entire situation had changed dramatically. These children weren't orphans after all. They had family who loved them and was willing to risk everything to find them. "How did you know to look here?" Jacob asked, still maintaining his defensive position despite the growing evidence that these men meant no harm. Henderson smiled again. "Maria's got tracking skills that put most white men to shame. She followed sign through country that would challenge a mountain man, kept at it even after the storm hit. Yesterday she found traces of children's footprints near the valley below. Your place, prints heading uphill toward your ranch. She wanted to come herself," Bradley added, "but she's still too weak from her ordeal. Doc ordered bed rest for at least another week, so she sent us to check on her babies to make sure they were safe." Jacob felt the weight of 15 years of isolation pressing against the sudden possibility of human connection and shared responsibility. These men were offering something he had never expected: help, not just temporary assistance, but genuine partnership in caring for the children who had become his responsibility. "They're here," he said finally, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "All 9 of them. They've been safe, though it's been challenging." Relief flooded both men's faces. Henderson actually removed his hat and ran his hand through his grey hair, a gesture that spoke of enormous tension finally released. Bradley's shoulders sagged, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from them. "Thank God," Henderson breathed. "Maria's been out of her mind with worry. We all have. Can we see them, just to confirm they're all right?" Jacob hesitated for a moment longer, then made a decision that would change everything. "Running Deer," he called toward the barn. "It's safe. Come out." The girl appeared in the barn doorway, her dark eyes wide with cautious hope. When she saw the two men, her entire body went rigid with tension. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward with the dignity that had impressed Jacob from their first meeting. "These men say they know your aunt," Jacob explained gently. "Maria Lightfoot. She's been looking for you." The transformation in Running Deer's face was immediate and dramatic. The careful control she had maintained for days cracked completely, revealing the frightened, grieving child beneath the mature exterior she had been forced to adopt. "Tia Maria," she whispered, the Spanish word for aunt coming naturally despite her usual preference for English. "She's alive. She is safe." "She's safe," Bradley confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "Worried sick about all of you, but safe. She's waiting in town, praying we'd find you alive and well." Behind Running Deer, the other children began to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by the sound of familiar names and the promise of connection to their lost world. Firewalker, still weak but recovering, leaned heavily on Silent Fox as they approached. The younger ones clustered together, uncertain whether to hope or fear. Jacob watched this reunion unfold and realized that his role in these children's lives was about to change dramatically. He was no longer their only protector, their sole lifeline in a hostile world. These men represented connection to family, community, and a future beyond mere survival in his isolated mountain refuge. But as he looked at the children's faces, saw the mixture of hope and uncertainty in their eyes, Jacob understood that the question of what came next was far more complex than simply reuniting families. These children had been through trauma that would affect them for years to come. They needed stability, safety, and time to heal. Most importantly, they needed adults in their lives who were committed to their well-being rather than simply their survival. The unexpected arrival of Marcus. Henderson and Tom Bradley had transformed Jacob's crisis from a desperate struggle for survival into something entirely different, an opportunity to build something lasting and meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. But first, there were immediate questions to address, practical arrangements to make, and most importantly, 9 children who needed to understand that their world, shattered just days before, was beginning to reassemble in ways they had never dared to hope. The transformation of Jacob's isolated mountain ranch into a temporary haven began within hours of Henderson and Bradley's arrival. What had been a desperate struggle for survival suddenly became a coordinated effort involving multiple adults with different skills and resources. For the first time in 15 years, Jacob found himself working as part of a team, and the experience was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. Marcus. Henderson proved to be a man of remarkable practical wisdom. Within an hour of confirming the children's safety, he had assessed their immediate needs and begun organizing solutions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex ranch operations. His weathered hands moved quickly as he examined their makeshift living conditions, calculated food requirements, and identified the most pressing concerns for their continued care. "First thing we need is proper shelter," Henderson announced after completing his survey. "This barn's been adequate for emergency circumstances, but 9 children can't spend a mountain winter in here. We need to expand your cabin, and we need to do it fast before the real cold sets in." Tom Bradley nodded agreement, his carpenter's eye already assessing the structural requirements. "I brought tools and some basic supplies, thinking we might need to do emergency repairs. We can start with a temporary addition, get them warm and dry, then work on something more permanent as weather permits." Jacob listened to these plans with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. For so many years, every decision about his property had been his alone to make. Now these men were discussing major modifications to his home, as if his agreement was already assumed. The presumption should have annoyed him, but instead he found himself relieved to share the burden of planning and decision-making. running. Deer approached the small group of adults with the quiet dignity that had impressed Jacob from their first meeting. "Mr. Henderson," she said formally, "may I ask about my aunt? Is she truly well? When can we see her?" Henderson's expression softened as he looked down at the girl. "She's recovering, child, but she's been through a hard time. The journey to find you nearly killed her, and she needs a few more days of rest before she's strong enough for mountain travel. But she sent messages for each of you." The older man reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "She wanted you to have this, to know that she carries you all in her heart." Running Deer accepted the bundle with trembling hands, unwrapping it to reveal a collection of small objects that Jacob didn't immediately recognize. But the effect on the children was immediate and profound. Several of them gasped in recognition, and tears began flowing freely as they gathered around to examine the contents. "Our grandmother's medicine pouch," Running Deer whispered, holding up a small leather bag decorated with intricate beadwork. "And father's carving tools, mother's silver bracelet." Each item she named brought fresh tears and murmured responses. In Apache from the other children, Henderson nodded solemnly. "Maria managed to save what she could when the soldiers came. She's been carrying these things, hoping to return them to their rightful owners. She said you'd understand their meaning." Jacob watched this emotional reunion with growing understanding of how little he truly knew about these children's lives before they appeared on his doorstep. Each object carried layers of meaning and memory that connected them to a world he couldn't fully comprehend. The beaded pouch, the carved tools, the silver jewelry, these weren't just possessions, but tangible links to family members they might never see again. Over the following days, as the three men worked together to expand the cabin's living space, Jacob found himself learning not just about construction and logistics, but about the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that connected these children to a larger community. Henderson had known Maria Lightfoot's family for over a decade, had traded with their village regularly, and considered many of its members personal friends rather than merely business associates. "People don't understand how civilized these communities were," Henderson explained as he and Jacob worked to frame a new room. Maria's village had a school where children learned English alongside their native language. They had a council that settled disputes peacefully, workshops where craftsmen created beautiful pottery and metalwork. These weren't the savage camps the newspapers write about. Bradley, who had married into this extended family network, provided even more personal insights. "My late wife Sarah used to say that her Apache relatives had better manners and stronger family values than most white folks she knew. These children have been raised with principles of honor, respect, and community responsibility that would put most frontier towns to shame." These conversations gradually shifted Jacob's understanding of his temporary charges from desperate refugees to displaced members of a sophisticated culture. He began to notice details he had missed before: the way the older children automatically cared for the younger ones, the quiet respect they showed for their elders, the careful way they shared limited resources without complaint or conflict. More importantly, he began to understand that his role as their protector carried responsibilities beyond mere physical survival. These children needed to maintain connection to their cultural identity while adapting to dramatically changed circumstances. They needed to process grief and trauma while remaining hopeful about their future. Most challengingly, they needed adults in their lives who could bridge the gap between their traditional world and the harsh realities of their current situation. The learning process worked both ways. As Jacob shared his knowledge of mountain survival, hunting techniques, and frontier medicine, he discovered that the children possessed skills and knowledge that complemented his own. Silent Fox proved to be remarkably gifted at tracking and wildlife observation, able to read animal sign that Jacob had missed. Morning Star had an intuitive understanding of plant medicine that enhanced Jacob's crude herbal treatments. Even the youngest children contributed insights about weather patterns, seasonal changes, and natural resource management. Apache children are raised to observe everything, Running Deer explained, as she helped Jacob identify edible plants that grew near his ranch. We learn to see what others miss, to understand the connections between all living things. It is how we survive when the world becomes dangerous. These collaborative learning sessions became daily rituals that strengthened bonds between Jacob and the children while building practical skills they would all need for long-term survival. Henderson and Bradley participated when their construction work permitted, contributing their own expertise while learning from both Jacob's mountain wisdom and the children's traditional knowledge. The construction of the cabin addition became a community project that involved everyone according to their abilities. The older boys helped with heavy lifting and basic carpentry. The girls assisted with measuring, organizing supplies, and preparing meals for the workers. Even the youngest children contributed by gathering kindling, collecting useful stones, and serving as messengers between work groups. Jacob found himself taking on an unexpected role as coordinator and teacher, skills that drew on his military leadership experience in ways he hadn't anticipated. The children responded to his quiet authority with respect rather than fear, sensing perhaps that his commands came from concern for their welfare rather than desire for dominance. "You're good with them," Henderson observed during a break from their construction work. "They trust you," which isn't easy for children who've been through what they have. Maria will be relieved to know they've found someone who understands their needs. The comment highlighted a growing complexity in Jacob's situation. What had begun as emergency shelter was evolving into something more permanent and comprehensive. These children weren't just surviving under his care, they were beginning to heal and grow. The question of their long-term future remained unresolved, but their immediate present was becoming increasingly stable and nurturing. Evening conversations around the expanded cabin's fireplace became opportunities for deeper cultural exchange. The children shared stories from their traditional culture, songs in Apache that spoke of mountain spirits and seasonal cycles, and explanations of customs that governed their previous community life. Jacob found himself contributing tales of his own childhood in Pennsylvania, military experiences that didn't involve combat, and observations about mountain wildlife that fascinated his young audience. Henderson and Bradley added their own perspectives during their extended stay, describing the growing town of Millerville, the challenges facing mixed communities in the changing West, and the political realities that would shape these children's futures regardless of their personal preferences. "The reservation system isn't working," Henderson said bluntly during one evening discussion. "Children are dying of diseases, adults are starving on government rations, and the traditional ways of life are being systematically destroyed. But communities like ours offer different possibilities. People judging each other by character rather than race, families helping families regardless of their backgrounds." These conversations helped Jacob understand that the choices facing these children weren't simply about returning to their traditional life or assimilating into white society. New models of community were emerging in some parts of the frontier, places where different cultures could coexist while maintaining their distinctive identities. As the cabin addition neared completion and Henderson and Bradley prepared for their return journey, Jacob realized that his relationship with these children had evolved far beyond emergency caretaker. He had become their teacher, protector, advocate, and in some ways their bridge to a future that would require them to navigate between multiple worlds. The alliance that had formed between Jacob, Henderson, and Bradley represented something new in his experience, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the children's welfare. For 15 years, Jacob had believed that meaningful relationships were impossible without inevitable betrayal and loss. Now he was discovering that trust could be built gradually through consistent actions and shared purpose. More significantly, he was learning that isolation hadn't protected him from pain as much as it had protected him from the possibility of healing. The children's presence had forced him to engage with life in ways that were challenging and sometimes overwhelming, but also profoundly meaningful. As he watched Running Deer teaching her younger cousins traditional beadwork patterns while Walker helped Bradley organize construction tools, Jacob understood that his mountain refuge had been transformed into something he had never imagined, a place where different worlds could meet and create something new together. The question now was whether this fragile alliance could survive the tests that lay ahead, and whether Jacob was strong enough to honor the trust that 9 children and 2 good men had placed in his weathered hands. The morning Henderson and Bradley prepared to leave dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant mountain light that made the snow-covered peaks gleam like polished silver. Jacob stood on the porch of his newly expanded cabin, watching the 2 men load their horses with supplies for the journey back to Millerville. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction. The construction project was complete. The children were safe and warm, and help was finally on the way. Instead, he felt an unexpected hollowness in his chest. For 2 weeks, Jacob had been part of something larger than himself. The collaborative effort to build proper shelter, the shared meals around an expanded table, the evening discussions about the children's future, all of it had created a sense of community he hadn't experienced since his military days. Now that partnership was dissolving, leaving him once again responsible for 9 lives with only his own resources and judgment to guide him. The addition should hold up well through the winter, Bradley said, securing the last of his tools to his saddle. I reinforced the joints with extra bracing, and the roof should shed snow without problem. Come spring, you might want to add a proper foundation, but it'll serve for now. Henderson finished tying down a bundle of supplies he was leaving behind, medical materials, additional blankets, and a precious cache of children's books that his own grandchildren had outgrown. Maria sends her love to all the young ones, he said, addressing the group of children who had gathered to see the men off. She's getting stronger every day, and she'll be up here to visit as soon as the doctor says she's fit for mountain travel. Running Deer stepped forward with the formal dignity that had become her trademark. Please tell our aunt that we are well cared for, and that we remember all the lessons she taught us about living with honor. We will make her proud. The other children murmured agreement in both English and Apache, their voices carrying a mixture of hope and uncertainty about when they might see their beloved aunt again. Walker, now fully recovered from his pneumonia but still somewhat frail, pressed a small carved wooden horse into Henderson's weathered hand. For Tia Maria, the boy said softly. So she knows we remember Father's teachings about working with our hands. Henderson accepted the gift with visible emotion, his tough rancher's composure cracking slightly. She'll treasure this son, and she'll know that you're growing into the kind of man your father would be proud of. As the 2 riders made their final preparations, Jacob found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of him was eager to return to the simplified routine that had governed his life before the children's arrival. Managing 9 young people was exhausting work that left little time for the quiet contemplation he had valued. But another part of him dreaded the isolation that would return once Henderson and Bradley disappeared down the mountain trail. You've got my word that we'll be back before Christmas, Henderson said, grasping Jacob's hand in a firm farewell shake. Maria's planning to bring presents for all the children, and we want to see how everyone's settling in. If you need anything before, then supplies, medicine, just someone to talk to, send one of the older boys down to Millerville. The whole town knows about these children now, and there are plenty of folks willing to help. The promise of continued support should have been reassuring, but Jacob recognized the practical limitations. Millerville was a hard day's ride in good weather, impossible to reach during the severe storms that could isolate his ranch for weeks at a time. When winter truly settled over the mountains, he and the children would be as alone as they had been during those first desperate days. Bradley clasped Jacob's shoulder with genuine warmth. "You've done something remarkable here," he said quietly. "These children were half dead when they reached your door, and now look at them. They're not just surviving, they're thriving. That's due to your care and dedication." Jacob watched the two men ride away until they disappeared into the pine forest, their horses' hoofbeats gradually fading until only mountain silence remained. Then he turned to find 9 pairs of dark eyes watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern. The children understood, perhaps better than he did, that this departure marked the end of one phase of their relationship and the beginning of another. "Well," Jacob said finally, his voice sounding strange in the sudden quiet, "I suppose we should check on the livestock." The return to normal routines felt different now. The expanded cabin buzzed with activity as the children settled into spaces that had been designed specifically for their needs. Running Deer organized the younger ones into work groups, ensuring that daily chores were distributed fairly and completed efficiently. The older boys took responsibility for maintaining the firewood supply and helping with outdoor tasks. Even the smallest children found ways to contribute, gathering eggs from the chickens and helping prepare meals. But beneath the surface efficiency, Jacob sensed undercurrents of anxiety that hadn't been present while Henderson and Bradley were there. The children had grown accustomed to having multiple adults available for guidance and support. Now they were back to depending entirely on one man whose experience with young people was limited and whose emotional reserves had been stretched thin by weeks of constant responsibility. The first real test came 3 days after the men's departure, when Little Wolf approached Jacob with tears streaming down his face and blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around his left hand. "I was trying to help split kindling," the boy stammered in a mixture of English and Apache. "The axe slipped and cut my hand. It won't stop bleeding, and it hurts very much." Jacob examined the wound with the clinical detachment his military medical training had taught him. The cut was deep enough to require stitches, potentially serious if infection set in, but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a routine injury, requiring basic first aid and careful monitoring. But these weren't normal circumstances. Jacob realized he was facing the first serious medical emergency since Henderson and Bradley's departure, and he had no backup support if complications developed. The nearest doctor was in Millerville, a day's journey away under good conditions. If Little Wolf's injury became infected or if other problems arose, Jacob would be entirely on his own in making decisions that could determine the boy's long-term health. "Running Deer," he called to the oldest girl, who was helping Morning Star with laundry. "I need you to assist me with your cousin's injury. Bring the medical supplies from the kitchen cabinet." The girl responded immediately, her composed efficiency a reminder of how much responsibility she had already shouldered despite her young age. As Jacob cleaned and examined the wound more thoroughly, Running Deer organized the other children, ensuring that the younger ones were occupied and out of the way, while still being reassured that their friend would be fine. "Will he need the needle medicine?" Running Deer asked quietly, using the Apache term for stitches that Jacob had learned during their time together. "Yes," Jacob replied, threading a needle with the careful precision his Army Medical Corps training had drilled into him. "It's deeper than it looks, and we can't risk it reopening. Can you help keep him still while I work?" The procedure went smoothly, but it highlighted Jacob's growing awareness of how precarious their situation remained despite the improvements in their living conditions. Every injury, every illness, every emergency would have to be handled with only the resources immediately at hand. There would be no consulting with other adults, no sharing of responsibility, no possibility of outside assistance until spring weather made travel reliable again. Over the following days, Jacob found himself hyper-aware of potential dangers that he had previously taken for granted. The axe that little Wolf had been using was perhaps too heavy for his small hands. The ladder to the cabin's loft might be too steep for the youngest children to navigate safely. The path to the well could become treacherously icy during the winter months ahead. Each potential hazard represented not just a risk to individual children, but a threat to Jacob's ability to maintain his role as their protector. A serious injury or illness that overwhelmed his medical capabilities could result in tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The weight of this responsibility began to press on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The psychological pressure was compounded by the children's own evolving needs. As they recovered from their initial trauma and began to feel secure in their new environment, normal childhood conflicts and competitions began to emerge. Silent Fox and Stone Bear engaged in increasingly elaborate pranks that sometimes resulted in tears or damaged property. Morning Star and Singing Bird developed a rivalry over Jacob's attention that led to arguments during meal preparation. Even the youngest children began testing boundaries, pushing against rules they had previously accepted without question. Jacob discovered that managing the social dynamics of 9 children required skills entirely different from the military, leadership or wilderness survival expertise he had relied on previously. Children needed different types of guidance than soldiers, responded to different motivational techniques, and required patience with developmental issues that had no clear solutions. The most challenging situation arose when Quiet Thunder, the second oldest boy, began exhibiting signs of what Jacob could only describe as depression. The child became increasingly withdrawn, participating in daily activities only when directly ordered, and spending long periods staring silently out the cabin windows toward the southern mountains where his village had been. "He grieves for our father," Running Deer explained when Jacob asked about her cousin's behavior. "Father and Quiet Thunder were very close. They hunted together, worked together, shared the same dreams about our people's future. Now Father is gone, and Quiet Thunder doesn't know how to live without him." The explanation highlighted yet another dimension of Jacob's responsibilities that he felt unprepared to handle. These children weren't just physical beings requiring food, shelter, and medical care. They were emotional beings carrying grief, trauma, and loss that would affect their development for years to come. They needed guidance in processing their experiences, hope for their futures, and help in building new identities that could incorporate both their traditional heritage and their changed circumstances. As November deepened and the first serious snow began to accumulate around the cabin, Jacob realized that Henderson and Bradley's departure had marked more than just the end of collaborative construction work. It had marked his transition from emergency caretaker to long-term guardian, from temporary shelter provider to primary adult influence in 9 young lives. The magnitude of this responsibility was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. For 15 years, Jacob had convinced himself that isolation was safety, that avoiding deep connections with others was the only way to prevent inevitable loss and pain. Now he found himself more deeply connected to other human beings than he had ever been, more invested in outcomes beyond his own survival, more committed to a future that extended far beyond his own needs. The children sensed the change in his role as well. They began bringing him problems and questions that went beyond immediate practical needs, seeking his opinions on everything from conflicts with siblings to worries about their missing parents. Jacob found himself dispensing advice about friendship, explaining concepts about honor and responsibility, and providing comfort for fears he wasn't sure he understood himself. Winter was coming, bringing with it months of isolation that would test every aspect of the relationships he had built with these children. There would be no outside help, no emergency backup, no relief from the constant demands of caring for 9 young lives in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But as Jacob watched Running Deer teach the younger children traditional songs, while Firewalker helped him repair leather goods by the cabin's fireplace, he realized that he was no longer afraid of the test ahead. The children had taught him something his 15 years of solitude never could, that some responsibilities were worth accepting regardless of their cost, and that some relationships were strong enough to justify the risks they entailed. The Helpers' departure had indeed marked the beginning of a new challenge, but it was a challenge Jacob Sullivan was finally ready to face. The riders appeared on the horizon just after dawn on December 18th, their dark silhouettes stark against the snow-covered landscape. Jacob spotted them from his position near the woodshed, where he had been splitting logs for the morning fire. Something in their approach, too direct, too purposeful, sent alarm bells ringing through his military-trained instincts. He counted 6 mounted figures moving in formation up the mountain trail, their pace steady and determined, despite the treacherous winter conditions. These weren't traders or friendly neighbors making a social call. This was an official party with official business, and Jacob's 15 years of hiding from his past told him exactly what kind of business brought federal representatives into the high country during winter. "Running Deer," he called quietly, to the girl who was feeding chickens near the barn. "Get the children inside immediately, all of them. Keep them away from the windows." The urgency in his voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Running Deer responded instantly, dropping the feed bucket and moving with fluid efficiency to gather her charges. Within minutes, 9 children had vanished into the expanded cabin, leaving behind only the evidence of their presence: fresh footprints in the snow, the sound of muffled voices through the log walls, and the knowledge that Jacob's carefully constructed sanctuary was about to face its greatest test. The lead rider was a man Jacob recognized with sinking certainty, even after 15 years. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had been his commanding officer during the Apache campaigns in Arizona Territory, the man who had issued the orders that ultimately drove Jacob to resign his commission in disgrace. Whitfield rode with the same rigid, military bearing that had intimidated junior officers and Indian leaders alike, his steel-gray hair visible beneath a fur-lined cavalry hat. Behind Whitfield rode 5 other men, 2 soldiers in winter uniforms, a civilian in expensive Eastern clothes who could only be a federal agent, and 2 figures that made Jacob's blood run cold. Apache scouts, their traditional clothing adapted for winter travel, their eyes scanning the terrain with the same professional assessment Jacob remembered from his military days. As the party approached the cabin, Jacob stepped into the open, his rifle held casually but ready. 15 years of mountain living had changed his appearance dramatically, but he knew Whitfield would recognize him. The question was whether this recognition would work for or against the children now hidden. "In his home, Jacob Sullivan," Whitfield called out as he reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin porch. "I've been a long time since Arizona Territory." "Colonel," Jacob replied evenly, neither confirming nor denying his identity. "Long way from Army headquarters. What brings you to my mountain?" Whitfield dismounted with the careful movements of a man, no longer young, but still dangerous. "Official business, I'm afraid. We're looking for some missing Apache children. 9 of them, to be precise. Word is, they might have found their way up here." The civilian pushed his horse forward, his soft, eastern features pinched with cold and irritation. "I am Federal Agent Harrison Clark, Bureau of Indian Affairs. These children are wards of the federal government, and they belong on the reservation where they can receive proper care and education." Jacob studied the two Apache scouts, trying to read their expressions. Both men appeared to be in their 30s, with the weathered faces of those who spent their lives outdoors. But something in their posture suggested reluctance rather than enthusiasm for their current mission. One of them met Jacob's eyes briefly, and what Jacob saw there was not hostility, but a kind of resigned sadness. "Don't know anything about any Apache children," Jacob said carefully. "Haven't seen anyone up here for months. You're welcome to look around if you think I'm lying." It was a calculated risk. The evidence of the children's presence was everywhere. For those who knew how to look, extra laundry hanging in the cabin, the expanded living space, the larger cooking pots visible through the windows. But Jacob was betting that most of these men wouldn't notice such details, and that those who did might choose not to see them. Agent Clark swung down from his saddle with obvious relief, his legs unsteady after the long ride. "We have reliable reports that 9 Apache children were seen in this area, children who fled from a military escort, taking them to their assigned reservation. Harboring them is a federal crime, Mr. Sullivan, punishable by substantial fines and imprisonment." The threat was delivered with bureaucratic precision, but Jacob could see uncertainty in the man's eyes. Clark was a desk administrator thrust into field conditions that challenged both his physical endurance and his understanding of frontier realities. He was operating on orders and regulations rather than first-hand knowledge of the situation. Whitfield, however, was a different matter entirely. The colonel's experienced gaze had already catalogued the signs of recent construction, the paths worn in the snow by multiple sets of small feet, the subtle indicators that suggested this isolated ranch was currently housing more people than its owner claimed. "Permission to search the premises, Sullivan?" Whitfield asked, his tone making it clear that permission was a courtesy rather than a requirement. Jacob nodded slowly, stepping aside to allow the search party access to his cabin. Inside, he knew, the children were hidden in the root cellar he had excavated beneath the new addition. The space was cramped and cold, but it was concealed behind a false wall that would require detailed examination to discover. As the federal party began their search, Jacob found his attention drawn to the 2 Apache scouts. Both men had remained mounted, their eyes fixed on the surrounding terrain rather than the cabin being searched. When the older of the two caught Jacob's eye, he made a barely perceptible gesture toward the tree line beyond the barn. Following the scout's subtle indication, Jacob spotted additional movement in the forest. More riders, these ones staying carefully concealed but positioned to observe the entire encounter. Apache warriors, Jacob realized, who had followed the federal party at a distance and were now watching to see how this confrontation would resolve. The implications were staggering. If the hidden children were discovered and taken by force, these concealed warriors might intervene to prevent their removal. The resulting conflict could turn Jacob's peaceful ranch into a battlefield with 9 innocent children caught in the crossfire between competing claims to their custody. Agent Clark emerged from the cabin after a thorough but unproductive search, his face flushed with frustration. "The living space has clearly been expanded recently," he announced to Whitfield, "and there are signs of occupation by more than one person, cooking utensils for multiple people, bedding arrangements that suggest child occupants, but no actual children," Whitfield observed dryly. "Interesting." The colonel approached Jacob with the calculating expression of a chess player, considering his next move. "You know, Sullivan, I always wondered what happened to you after Arizona. You were a good officer, despite that unfortunate business at the end. Resignation in disgrace, wasn't it? Something about refusing to carry out lawful orders. The words were delivered casually, but their intent was clear. Whitfield was reminding Jacob that his past contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited if necessary. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cooperate now, or face renewed scrutiny of old decisions that had already cost him his military career. My resignation was accepted by the appropriate authorities, Jacob replied evenly. I've been living peacefully here ever since, bothering no one and causing no trouble. Peaceful, yes, Whitfield agreed. But harboring fugitive Indian children would definitely constitute trouble, wouldn't it? The kind of trouble that might require a former officer to face court-martial proceedings for conduct unbecoming, even in civilian life. The threat escalated the confrontation to a new level. Jacob realized that Whitfield was prepared to use every legal and administrative tool at his disposal to force compliance with federal Indian policy. The colonel wasn't just searching for missing children, he was enforcing a broader agenda that viewed any resistance to reservation placement as a threat to governmental authority. From inside the cabin came the sound of muffled coughing, one of the younger children responding involuntarily to the stress of hiding in the cold root cellar. The sound was faint but unmistakable to ears trained by military experience. Agent Clark's head snapped toward the cabin, his expression suddenly alert. "That sounded like a child," he said sharply. "Colonel, I believe there are children in that building." Whitfield nodded grimly and signaled to his soldiers. "Detailed search, every room, every closet, every possible hiding space. And if you find concealed areas, tear them open." Jacob felt the situation slipping beyond his control. In minutes, the soldiers would discover the hidden root cellar and the children concealed within. Once found, the children would be removed, by force if necessary, taken to a reservation system that Henderson had described as a place where children died of disease and despair. But as the soldiers prepared to conduct their thorough search, one of the Apache scouts finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the mountain air, and he addressed his words to Colonel Whitfield in accented but precise English. "Colonel, we have found what we came to find." Whitfield turned sharply toward the scout. "You've located the children?" The scout gestured toward the forest where his hidden companions waited. "Children are safe. Children are with their families. Mission is complete." Agent Clark looked confused by this development. "What families?" The reports indicated these children were orphaned when their village was attacked. The second scout spoke for the first time, his words careful and deliberate. "Reports were wrong. Families survived. Children returned to families. Government concern is no longer necessary." Jacob realized what was happening with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The Apache scouts, pressed into service to track down their own people's children, were providing false information to end the search. They were claiming the children had been found and returned to their families, making continued pursuit unnecessary. It was a brilliant tactical maneuver, but one that carried enormous risks for the scouts themselves. If their deception were discovered, they would face severe punishment from their federal employers. They were gambling their own safety to protect 9 children they had never met. Whitfield's expression suggested he suspected the deception, but couldn't prove it. "Where exactly did you locate these families? I'll need detailed reports for the bureau files." The older scout met his gaze steadily. "Families move, seasonal hunting grounds, children safe with blood relatives, federal responsibility ended." The bureaucratic language was perfectly chosen to satisfy administrative requirements, while providing no actionable information. Agent Clark looked uncertain, clearly wanting to continue the search, but lacking grounds to dispute the scout's professional assessment. Jacob recognized the moment when the confrontation would either escalate to violence or resolve through diplomatic withdrawal. Everything depended on whether Whitfield was prepared to challenge the scout's report, despite his obvious suspicions. After a long moment that felt like an eternity, Whitfield remounted his horse. "Very well. If the children have been returned to their families, our mission here is complete. We'll file the appropriate reports and close this case." Agent Clark looked frustrated, but followed his military escort back to their horses. As the federal party prepared to leave, Whitfield approached Jacob one final time. "This isn't over, Sullivan," he said quietly. "I know those children are here somewhere, and I know you're protecting them. But I also know that pushing this confrontation further would likely result in bloodshed that serves no one's interests." The colonel glanced meaningfully toward the tree line, where Apache warriors remained hidden but vigilant. "Sometimes discretion really is the better part of valor, but don't mistake tactical withdrawal for permanent retreat. Federal policy regarding Indian children will be enforced one way or another." As the search party disappeared down the mountain trail, Jacob stood alone in his yard, surrounded by evidence of the children's presence, but no longer immediately threatened by their discovery. The Apache scouts had saved them all through a combination of courage, cleverness, and willingness to sacrifice their own safety for strangers. But Whitfield's parting words carried a promise of future confrontation. The federal government's determination to control Indian children hadn't disappeared, it had merely been postponed. Jacob understood that this victory was temporary and that the final resolution of the children's fate would require more than hiding and hoping for the best. Inside the cabin, 9 voices called out in relief as the children emerged from their cramped concealment. But their joy at immediate safety was tempered by the knowledge that their security remained fragile, dependent on the continued goodwill of strangers and the tactical calculations of distant bureaucrats. The final test had been passed, but Jacob realized it was only the first of many challenges that would determine whether these children could build lasting lives in a world that seemed determined to control their destiny. The second wave of federal agents arrived on a bitter January morning, 6 weeks after Colonel Whitfield's tactical retreat. This time, there would be no diplomatic withdrawal or convenient deceptions to save Jacob and the children. The new party consisted of 12 men, federal marshals, Indian Affairs agents, and a full military escort commanded by a captain who clearly had no intention of accepting anything less than complete compliance with federal mandates. Jacob watched their approach from his cabin window, counting rifles and assessing tactical positions with the cold calculation of his military training. Behind him, Running Deer stood silent and composed, though he could see the tension in her shoulders as she absorbed the implications of this overwhelming force. "There are too many this time," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same mature assessment that had impressed him since their first meeting. "And they come prepared for resistance." Jacob nodded grimly, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle that leaned against the window frame. The children were hidden again in the root cellar, but this search party would not be deterred by empty rooms or false explanations. These men had come to collect their quarry, and they had brought enough firepower to overcome any opposition he might offer. "The Territorial Education Commissioner will arrive next week for the annual inspection," she reported, handing him an official letter. "And Maria sent word that she's bringing 3 more children from the reservation, their families. Specifically requested placement here rather than the government boarding school in Denver." Jacob accepted the letter with the mixture of pride and apprehension that had become familiar over the years. The Mountain Valley School had gained a reputation throughout the territory for producing educated, capable young people who maintained strong cultural identities while mastering the skills needed for success in the changing American West. But this success had also attracted unwanted attention from federal authorities who preferred more controlled approaches to Indian education. Schools' unconventional methods challenged prevailing assumptions about cultural assimilation and educational policy. Rather than forcing Apache children to abandon their heritage, Jacob and his growing staff of teachers encouraged them to become bridges between worlds. Students learned English and mathematics alongside traditional Apache skills. They studied American history while also learning the oral traditions of their own people. Firewalker, now 12 and healthy beyond anything Jacob had dared hope during those first desperate days, emerged from the schoolhouse carrying an armload of books, in both English and Spanish. His recovery from near death had been complete, and he had developed into one of the school's most promising students, equally comfortable discussing European literature and traditional Apache healing practices. "Mr. Sullivan," he called out with the easy familiarity that characterized relationships at the school. "The new students from Santa Fe want to know if they can organize a music program that includes both their corridos and our traditional songs." "What do you think?" Jacob replied, a teaching technique that encouraged students to develop their own problem-solving abilities. "Can different musical traditions be combined in ways that honor both cultures?" Firewalker grinned, the expression transforming his serious face into something boyish and enthusiastic. "Running Deer and I have been working on arrangements that weave Apache chants with Mexican guitar melodies. The results are interesting." The evolution of Jacob's teaching philosophy had been gradual but profound. His military background had initially inclined him towards structured, hierarchical approaches to education. But the children had taught him that learning flourished when students felt safe to experiment, make mistakes, and discover connections between different ways of understanding the world. Maria Lightfoot approached from the direction of the dormitory, building that had been constructed to house children whose families lived too far away for daily attendance. At 45, Maria had become the school's cultural coordinator, ensuring that Apache traditions were preserved and transmitted even as students mastered contemporary academic subjects. "Jacob," she said, using the informal address that reflected their partnership in developing the school's unique programs, "I've received a disturbing letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're planning another inspection, this time with the specific goal of evaluating our compliance with federal education standards." The euphemism didn't disguise the underlying threat. Federal policy regarding Indian education had become increasingly rigid, emphasizing total cultural assimilation and the elimination of traditional languages and customs. Schools that deviated from approved curricula faced closure, while their students were forcibly transferred to institutions that prioritized cultural destruction over educational excellence. Jacob accepted the letter with familiar dread. Every few years, federal authorities attempted to bring the Mountain Valley School into compliance with policies that its very success proved to be misguided. Each inspection became a battle to defend educational approaches that worked against bureaucratic mandates that didn't. "When?" he asked, scanning the official document with its mixture of legal language and barely concealed hostility. "August 15th, Maria replied. "They're giving us 2 months to correct deficiencies in our program before conducting a comprehensive evaluation. The timing was strategically chosen to coincide with the beginning of the new school year, when enrollment would be highest and the school's unconventional methods most visible to federal observers. It was also just before the territorial legislature was scheduled to review funding for educational programs, making the school's political position particularly vulnerable." Running Deer, who had been listening to the exchange with growing concern, spoke up with the directness that had characterized her personality since childhood. "What deficiencies? Our students consistently outperform those from government schools on every academic measure. They speak multiple languages, understand complex mathematical concepts, and demonstrate critical thinking skills that impress university professors. The deficiency, Jacob replied with bitter accuracy, is that our students remain proud of their Apache heritage while excelling in academic subjects. Federal policy prefers students who abandon their cultural identity in exchange for basic literacy. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Marcus Henderson, now in his late 60s, but still riding with the easy competence that had impressed Jacob during their first meeting years ago. Behind him rode a young woman Jacob didn't recognize, her posture and clothing suggesting someone from an urban environment rather than frontier ranch country. "Morning, Jacob," Henderson called out as he dismounted near the schoolhouse. "Like you to meet someone. This is Miss Catherine Brennan from the Territorial Education Department. She's here to observe your operation before the federal inspection." Miss Brennan dismounted with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to long horseback rides. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with the serious demeanor of a professional educator and the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone confronting frontier realities for the first time. "Mr. Sullivan," she said formally, "I've heard remarkable reports about your school's methods and results. The Territorial Commissioner asked me to conduct a preliminary evaluation to help determine how best to support your programs during the upcoming federal review." The diplomatic language couldn't entirely conceal Miss Brennan's genuine curiosity about educational approaches that challenged conventional wisdom. Jacob had learned to recognize the difference between bureaucrats seeking reasons to close his school and educators genuinely interested in learning from its successes. "Would you like to observe some classes?" Jacob offered. "The students are currently engaged in what we call integrated learning, academic subjects taught through practical applications that connect to students' cultural backgrounds." Over the following hours, Miss Brennan observed lessons that would have been impossible in conventional schools. She watched Apache children demonstrate mathematical concepts through traditional beadwork patterns while explaining geometric principles in perfect English. She observed students conducting scientific experiments while discussing how their results related to traditional Apache understanding of natural processes. Most impressively, she witnessed a history lesson where students analyzed the same historical events from multiple cultural perspectives, developing critical thinking skills while gaining deep understanding of how different groups experienced the same period. The sophistication of their analysis would have challenged college-level students, while their respectful engagement with different viewpoints demonstrated social maturity rarely seen in young people. "This is extraordinary," Miss Brennan admitted, during a private conversation with Jacob later that afternoon. "These children demonstrate academic excellence while maintaining strong cultural identities. They're not being forced to choose between education and heritage. They're being shown how both can strengthen each other." Jacob nodded, recognizing an ally rather than an adversary. "That's been our fundamental principle from the beginning. Cultural diversity strengthens rather than weakens educational outcomes when it's properly integrated into curriculum design. But the federal inspectors won't see it that way," Miss Brennan warned. "Current policy views cultural preservation as incompatible with educational progress. They'll be looking for evidence of non-compliance with assimilation requirements." The conversation continued as Jacob explained the school's history, its educational philosophy, and the practical challenges of maintaining federal support while serving students' actual needs rather than bureaucratic mandates. Miss Brennan listened with growing understanding of how educational policy often conflicted with educational effectiveness. As evening approached, Miss Brennan joined the school, community for dinner in the large dining hall that had been built to accommodate the growing student population. She watched Apache children conversing easily with Mexican and white classmates, observed traditional foods being shared alongside contemporary American dishes, and witnessed the kind of genuine multicultural community that existed nowhere else. "In the territory, Mr. Sullivan," she said, as the meal concluded, "I need to ask you directly. What do you plan to do when the federal inspectors arrive? Your methods are clearly superior to conventional approaches, but they violate current policy in fundamental ways." Jacob looked around the dining hall at the faces of students who had become like family to him over the years. Some had arrived as desperate refugees, like the original 9 Apache children. Others came from families seeking educational opportunities unavailable elsewhere. All had thrived in an environment that valued their individual backgrounds while preparing them for success in American society. "Miss Brennan," he said finally, "5 years ago, 9 Apache children knocked on my door asking for help. They were dying, and they had nowhere else to turn. I made a decision that day to help them regardless of the consequences." He paused, watching running deer help younger students clear dishes, while Firewalker organized evening study groups with the casual competence that characterized daily life at the school. Since then, every decision I've made has been guided by the same principle: what's best for these children, regardless of what's convenient for bureaucrats or politically acceptable to government officials. When the federal inspectors arrive, I'll show them exactly what we do here and why it works. If they choose to close us down for being too successful, that's their choice." Miss Brennan smiled with genuine admiration. "Mr. Sullivan, you may have more allies than you realize. There are people within the territorial education system who understand that current federal policies are failing the children they're supposed to help. Your school represents proof that better approaches are possible." Over the following weeks, word of the impending federal inspection spread throughout the territory. Parents began arriving to observe classes, community leaders requested meetings with school administrators, and newspapers sent reporters to document what was being called the Mountain Valley Experiment in multicultural education. The attention was both supportive and concerning. While many people admired the school's success, others viewed its methods as dangerous departures from established norms. The political debate surrounding Indian education was intensifying throughout the American West, with the Mountain Valley School becoming a symbol of competing philosophies about assimilation, cultural preservation, and educational effectiveness. As August approached, Jacob found himself preparing for what might be the final confrontation in his long struggle to protect the children who had transformed his isolated mountain refuge into something unprecedented. The federal inspection would determine whether their educational experiment could continue, or whether 9 Apache children who had once knocked on his door asking for help would see their sanctuary destroyed by the same governmental policies, and that had scattered their families years before. But as he watched his students prepare for their own roles in the upcoming evaluation, confident, articulate, proud of both their heritage and their achievements, Jacob realized that whatever happened, during the inspection, the Mountain Valley School had already succeeded in its most important mission. It had proven that different cultures could strengthen rather than threaten each other, that education could preserve rather than destroy cultural identity, and that children from any background could thrive when treated with respect and provided with genuine opportunities for growth. The 9 Apache children who had arrived as desperate refugees had become young adults ready to bridge different worlds while remaining true to their own values. Their success was measured not just in academic achievements, but in their confidence, their compassion, and their commitment to helping others as they had once been helped. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, the Mountain Valley School stood as proof that sometimes the most important victories were won not through confrontation, but through the quiet persistence of people who refuse to abandon their principles, regardless of the cost. The letter arrived on a grey March morning, 8 months after Marshal Crawford had taken the children away. Jacob found it tucked under his door when he emerged from the small cabin in Cedar Falls, where he had been living since his forced exile from the mountain ranch. The envelope bore the official seal of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, but the handwriting that spelled his name was unmistakably familiar. Jacob's hands trembled as he opened Running Deer's letter, the first direct contact he had received from any of the children since their separation. Her careful penmanship had improved dramatically, but her distinctive voice came through clearly in every carefully chosen word. "Dear Mr. Sullivan," the letter began, "I write to you in secret, as we are not permitted to correspond with our former guardians. But I must tell you what has happened to us and what we have learned in this place they call a school. They have cut our hair and burned our clothes. They have forbidden us to speak Apache, even to each other, and they punish us harshly. When they hear our native words, they tell us our names are too difficult for civilized people to pronounce, so Firewalker is now called William, Silent Fox is Thomas, and I have become Mary. They say our parents were savages, and we must forget everything they taught us if we wish to become useful citizens. But Mr. Sullivan, we remember what you told us about honor and courage. We remember that our people have survived many hardships by holding on to what matters most. And we have discovered something that I think will interest you greatly. We are not alone here." Jacob paused in his reading, his heart racing as he absorbed the implications of Running Deer's words. The letter continued in the same measured tone, but he could sense growing excitement beneath her careful composure. "There are children here from many tribes, Lakota, Cherokee, Navajo, Cheyenne, and dozens of others. Some have been here for years, and they have learned to survive in ways their teachers do not suspect. They maintain the old languages through songs they sing while working. They preserve traditional stories by weaving them into the compositions they write for English class. They keep their spiritual practices alive through prayers that sound like the Christian hymns we are required to memorize. Most importantly, they have been waiting for children like us, children who remember what it means to resist while appearing to comply. The older students have created what they call the Underground River, a network that helps new arrivals maintain their identities while learning the skills they need to survive in the white world. Firewalker, William, has become their star, student in the mechanical arts program. But what the teachers do not know is that he is using his position to teach traditional Apache craftsmanship techniques to children from other tribes. He has learned that the wisdom of our ancestors can be preserved even when it is disguised as industrial training. I have been selected for advanced education because of my English writing abilities. The teachers praise me for abandoning my primitive background so completely. But what they do not understand is that I am using their own tools to preserve our stories. Every essay I write contains hidden messages in our traditional narrative, in patterns. Every poem I compose carries the rhythms of our ancient songs. The younger ones struggle more with the separation from everything they have known. Small eagle cries at night for his mother, and singing bird has stopped speaking entirely for weeks at a time. But the older students help them, teaching them secret ways to honor their grief while avoiding the punishment that open mourning would bring. Mr. Sullivan, I wanted you to know that your lessons have not been wasted. When you taught us to survive by adapting without surrendering, you were preparing us for exactly this situation. We are not being destroyed by this place. We are learning to transform it from within." Jacob set the letter down, overwhelmed by a mixture of pride, heartbreak, and growing understanding. The children had not merely survived their forced relocation, They had become leaders in a resistance movement that preserved indigenous cultures while mastering the skills of the dominant society. The letter continued with more specific details about their daily lives, their academic progress, and their careful navigation of institutional rules designed to eliminate their cultural identities. But it was the final section that stopped Jacob's breath entirely. "There is something else I must tell you, something that will perhaps seem impossible, but is nonetheless true. 3 weeks ago, a new teacher arrived at Carlisle. She's young, perhaps 25, with red hair and kind eyes. She says her name is Miss Catherine Walsh, and she teaches in the advanced composition program. But Mr. Sullivan, when she thought, no one was looking, I saw her make the hand sign for friend in Apache, a gesture so subtle and precise that only someone trained in our language would recognize it. When I approached her privately, she whispered a single word in perfect Apache pronunciation: resistance. I believe, Mr. Sullivan, that there are people within the system who understand what is truly happening here. People who are working to help us preserve what the school was designed to destroy. Miss Walsh has begun teaching us about what she calls cultural documentation, supposedly for academic research, but actually to help us record and preserve our traditional knowledge in ways that cannot be detected by hostile administrators. She has told us that there is a growing network of people, teachers, government workers, sympathetic officials, who believe the current policies toward Indian children are not only morally wrong, but practically counterproductive. These people are working quietly to document the failures of forced assimilation while helping students maintain their cultural connections. Most importantly, she has told us about a man who has been writing letters to newspapers, speaking at public meetings, and lobbying territorial legislators about the need for educational approaches that preserve rather than destroy indigenous cultures. This man, she says, has personal experience caring for Apache children and understands better than most government officials what such children actually need to thrive in American society. Mr. Sullivan, I believe this man is you." Jacob's hands were shaking so badly he could barely read the remaining paragraphs of Running Deer's letter. Since his forced departure from the mountain ranch, he had indeed been writing extensively about his experiences with the 9 Apache children. His articles had been published in newspapers throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, drawing attention to the gap between official government policy and actual educational effectiveness. More significantly, his first-hand account of cultural preservation combined with academic excellence had attracted the attention of progressive educators, sympathetic government officials, and reform-minded citizens who questioned the wisdom of destroying indigenous cultures in the name of civilization. The letter's conclusion brought tears to his eyes as Running Deer's mature voice carried him back to those months when his isolated ranch had become a haven for desperate children. "We wanted you to know that we are not lost, Mr. Sullivan. We are not broken or defeated or transformed into pale copies of white children. We are Apache, and we are proud, and we are learning to fight for our people's future in ways our ancestors never imagined. But we are also something new, children who belong equally to both worlds, who can speak the language of our oppressors while maintaining the wisdom of our elders. You helped make us into bridges between worlds, and now we are using that strength to help other children find their own paths between tradition and survival." The underground river grows stronger every month. Children who arrive broken and terrified learn to find hope and purpose. Traditional knowledge that was supposed to disappear forever is being preserved and transmitted to new generations. And most importantly, a network of resistance is developing that extends far beyond the walls of any single institution. Miss Walsh has told us that there are similar movements at other schools, that sympathetic teachers and officials throughout The Indian education system are working to preserve what they officially claim to be destroying. She says that change comes slowly to large institutions, but that it does come when enough people refuse to accept that current methods are the only possible approaches. We hope someday to see you again, though we do not know when or how such a reunion might be possible. Until then, we carry your lessons in our hearts and apply your wisdom to challenges you could never have imagined. Thank you for showing us that survival and honor are not contradictory goals. Thank you for teaching us that love sometimes requires great courage. And thank you for proving that one person's willingness to help can change the course of many lives. We remain with deep respect and continuing affection, your Apache children who will never forget the mountain man who opened his door when we had nowhere else to turn. Running Deer, who answers to Mary but remains herself. Firewalker, William in the day, but still Firewalker in his dreams. Silent, Fox, Little Wolf, Morning Star, Singing Bird, Stone Bear, Quiet Thunder and Small Eagle, all carrying new names but ancient hearts. Jacob sat in his small cabin, surrounded by the fruits of 8 months of intensive writing and advocacy work. His desk was covered with correspondence from educators, government officials, newspaper editors, and concerned citizens throughout the American West. His articles about alternative approaches to Indian education had generated responses from as far away as Washington, D.C., where congressional representatives were beginning to question the effectiveness of current federal policies. But none of this professional recognition mattered as much as the knowledge that the 9 children who had transformed his life were not merely surviving their ordeal, but were actively transforming it into something that served their own purposes and those of countless other indigenous children. The letter from Running Deer had revealed something Jacob had never dared to hope. His small act of opening his door to desperate children had become part of a much larger movement toward justice, understanding and genuine education that honored rather than destroyed cultural diversity. 3 days later, Jacob received a second letter, this one bearing the return address of Miss Catherine Walsh at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Her message was brief but electrifying in its implications. Dear Mr. Sullivan, your former charges have told me of the extraordinary care they received during their time with you. Their academic excellence, cultural pride, and emotional resilience stand in stark contrast to the broken spirits I typically encounter among newly arrived students. I am writing to inform you of a developing opportunity that may interest you greatly. A coalition of progressive educators, sympathetic government officials, and concerned citizens is organizing to establish experimental schools that combine rigorous academic instruction with respect for indigenous cultures. These institutions would serve as demonstration projects, proving that cultural preservation and educational excellence are not merely compatible, but mutually reinforcing. The coalition is seeking individuals with proven experience in multicultural education and deep understanding of indigenous perspectives to serve as founding administrators for these experimental schools. Your published writings and documented success with Apache children have made you a leading candidate for such a position. I have been authorized to invite you to a planning conference in Denver next month, where the specific details of this initiative will be discussed. The children you cared for have specifically requested that I extend this invitation, believing that you, above all others, understand what such schools should strive to achieve. The movement toward educational justice grows stronger every day. Mr. Sullivan, children like Running Deer and Firewalker are proving that indigenous cultures produce not obstacles to education, but resources for excellence that the current system criminally wastes. We hope you will consider joining us in this effort to create institutions worthy of the children they claim to serve. Most respectfully, Catherine Walsh, Underground River Coordinator, Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Jacob read Miss Walsh's letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of possibility and implication. The children's suffering had not been meaningless. It had become the foundation for a movement that could prevent other children from enduring similar trauma, while opening new pathways for Indigenous students to thrive academically while maintaining their cultural identities. More importantly, the invitation represented an opportunity to transform his own relationship with the children from memory into active partnership. Instead of simply remembering the months they had shared on his mountain ranch, he could work alongside them to create institutions that embodied the principles they had discovered together. 2 weeks later, Jacob stood before a gathering of 50 educators, government officials, tribal leaders, and concerned citizens in a Denver conference hall. His presentation about the 9 Apache children who had knocked on his door became a rallying cry for fundamental changes in federal Indian education policy. These children did not need to have their cultures destroyed in order to master academic subjects, he told the assembled audience. They needed to have their cultures respected and integrated into curricula that built upon their existing knowledge rather than rejecting it as worthless. He described running deer's natural leadership abilities, firewalker's mechanical aptitude, silent fox's artistic talents, and the remarkable resilience all 9 children had demonstrated when their cultural identities were honored rather than attacked. The current system treats Indigenous cultures as obstacles to overcome rather than resources to be developed, Jacob continued. This approach not only causes unnecessary suffering, but also wastes human potential that could benefit American society as a whole. His presentation concluded with a proposal that drew sustained applause from the assembled reformers: the establishment of the Mountain Valley Institute, a residential school that would serve Indigenous children from throughout the American West, while pioneering educational approaches that combined cultural preservation with academic excellence. "We will prove," Jacob declared, "that children thrive when they are allowed to be proud of who they are while learning the skills they need for success in American society. We will demonstrate that diversity strengthens rather than weakens educational outcomes, and we will show that institutions built on respect and understanding produce better citizens than those built on forced conformity and cultural destruction." The funding was approved unanimously. Within 6 months, construction began on a campus in the mountains of Colorado, not far from Jacob's original ranch. The first students would arrive in September, including 9 young people who had learned to navigate between worlds while never forgetting where they came from. On a crisp autumn morning, Jacob stood on the porch of the main building at the Mountain Valley Institute, watching as a stagecoach wound its way up the mountain road toward the campus. Through the windows, he could see familiar faces that had matured and changed over the months of separation, but retained the essential dignity and strength he remembered. Running Deer was the first to disembark, now 15 and carrying herself, with the confident bearing of someone who had survived trials that would have broken many adults. She approached Jacob with the same formal composure that had characterized their relationship from the beginning, but her eyes sparkled with barely contained emotion. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, extending her hand in greeting, "we have returned." "Welcome, home," Jacob replied, grasping her hand and finding it steady and strong. "Welcome to your school." Firewalker emerged from the coach, carrying a carefully wrapped bundle that Jacob recognized as traditional Apache crafting tools. "I learned many things at Carlisle," the young man said with quiet satisfaction. "But I never forgot what you taught me about maintaining honor while adapting to circumstances. Now I want to teach others what I have learned. One by one, the other children, no longer children but young adults who had been tempered by adversity into something remarkably strong, greeted Jacob with mixtures of formality and affection that spoke to relationships forged under extraordinary circumstances. But it was Small Eagle, now 11, and still the youngest of the group, who provided the moment that defined Jacob's understanding of what they had all accomplished together. The boy approached with the careful dignity that all the children had learned to use as both shield and sword. But when he reached Jacob, his composure cracked into the first genuine smile Jacob had seen from him in over a year. "Mr. Sullivan," Small Eagle said in Apache, his words carrying clearly in the mountain air, "we never forgot what you told us. We survived by remembering who we are." As the 9 former refugees joined the other students gathering for the Institute's opening ceremony, Jacob realized that their story had come full circle in ways none of them could have predicted during those desperate October days when desperate children had knocked on his cabin door. They had asked for help, and he had provided shelter. But what they had given him in return was far more valuable than what he had offered them. They had shown him what it meant to choose courage over safety, love over isolation, hope over despair. The Mountain Valley Institute would serve hundreds of indigenous children over the coming decades, proving that educational excellence and cultural preservation were not competing goals, but complementary strengths. But its true legacy would always be measured in the 9 Apache children who had taught a broken man that the only way to heal from loss was to risk loving again. As the sun set over the Colorado Rockies, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob Sullivan stood surrounded by students who represented dozens of tribal nations, all of them learning that they could honor their ancestors while building successful futures in American society. The words, "running deer," had spoken. As a 12-year-old refugee echoed in his memory, "We're dying, sir." But they had not died. They had been transformed by hardship into bridges between worlds, teachers who would pass on both traditional wisdom and modern knowledge to generations of children who would never have to choose between their heritage and their dreams. Jacob's response to their original plea had been simple: temporary shelter from a storm. But what they had built together was something far more lasting and significant, proof that love really could triumph over hatred, that understanding could overcome prejudice, and that children from any background could thrive when treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The 9 Apache children had knocked on his door asking for help. In the end, they had given him something far more precious than anything he could offer them: a reason to believe that individual acts of courage and compassion could change the world. One child at a time, they had asked to stay until the storm passed. Instead, they had stayed forever, not as refugees, but as partners in building a future worthy of their remarkable strength and unshakable dignity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.